Hi, Alex. Good morning from me. It's about midday your time.
Yep, midday, just about coming up on noon here shortly here in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Excellent. Thank you for joining, and good to finally get you on as well. I know we've crossed paths many times, both socially online and through various Slack channels and everything. So glad to finally get you on for an actual live stream.
Absolutely, really appreciate the opportunity here. It's been good getting to know you there, and nice to see you nearly face to face at some conference. I'm sure we'll
Exactly.
run into
Yeah.
each other.
An e meetup as they refer to it usually.
I think
Um,
so.
Yeah, exactly. But the I think it's also a good chance to cover a new topic that's been talked about, certainly on various other streams, but I don't think has ever been a focus specifically, which is going to be the conversation around Databricks, which is something that you certainly specialize in, and it's part of the ecosystem that I interact with on a regular basis, but not something that I'm much of an expert in myself. So I'll even be taking away quite a few notes and takeaways from this, but
Mhm.
with most of my streams, I'd love a chance to get started by maybe giving you an opportunity to introduce yourself to the channel a little bit and give a background about yourself before we get into the topic of the day.
Absolutely, yeah, and thanks again for the opportunity. Great to
Hmm.
be on the stream. So yeah, Alex Barbeau. I am a several titles. I've had many hats lately. Uh, I work for a company called Avanade. It's a Microsoft and Accenture joint venture, which is where I've gotten a lot of this experience. Been there for about 5 years. Before that, was working with a boutique company in Minnesota. Specializing in business intelligence. Actually worked with Greg Baldini while I was there. So that's how he and I know each other. Who was previous guest. So it's been fun as seeing all that. And then here talking on my own. What have I been doing? Why am I here? I've been working with Power BI, since Power Pivot since late 2013, I want to say. Luckily found that as I was in the middle of a master data project that needed a lot of data analysis, and I had to. It got to the point where I learned Excel array formulas. At that point, I was like, I'm losing my mind. This is absurd. And then like a bolt from the blue, Power Pivot suddenly appeared in my life. I took an Excel training, and the very last section was Power Pivot. And since then, it's been all columnar data all the time, work-wise at least. And so started using Databricks in 2019, 2018, about then. But yeah, otherwise here, I mean, be plenty more. I'll talk on a few other things, but love to travel a lot. When I'm not doing data work, help
Same.
all sorts of helping all sorts of large companies, build things, build powerful things, data tools with Databricks, with Power BI, with everything in between. I'm one of the Fabric leads for Avanade, sort of locally. So really run the gambit. I've even used Snowflake. Um,
I mean, it's something I've never built anything in Snowflake, but I think most of us in Power BI who do any type of consulting connect to it on a fairly regular basis as a point of ingestion. It's outside of Microsoft and maybe Azure, AWS is one of the most common spots to store data these days.
yep, for sure, for sure.
Excellent. The I think just as a quick mention with Greg as well, like I know you have had a lot of working interactions with him, but he's also been one of the favorite people that I've gotten on my streams as well. And there's few individuals who just stores so much code in their brain, and like we're both part of like a for the people tuning in like a Slack channel of some industry experts and other stuff, and every once in a while, like somebody would post a question on something in DAX, a Power Query, this, and we get a response from Greg that's quite long, like, "Oh, like, are you just like, no, 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 I'm on mobile, like out and about right now, but like,
Hmm.
and the syntax might be slightly off, but this is essentially how you do it. I just type this from my brain."
Yeah,
It's like without autocompletes and IntelliSense, I struggle a lot more to actually type syntax for sure because I'm so used to that. But he can just do it off the cuff in like 5 minutes, just directly from his phone, and it's one of the few
hmm,
people that I think is really proficient in code, and he likes to peel apart the onion to the absolute core layer
absolutely.
of any language. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was great to learn from him and do all that. Yeah, I think we only worked on one project directly together. All the other times it was, helping each other out. But that was also like a 5 billion row financial services model with three slowly changing dimensions built on top of slowly changing dimensions. So it was like, all right, yeah, like that was a fun one. Not using Databricks though. That one was using on-prem SQL Server, if I recall right. That was a good time.
Anytime you can geek out with someone and get into a deep dive where everybody else around you just starts to ignore you, but you two get really into it, I feel like those are good conversations.
Absolutely.
But come into the topic of the day today, and you're speaking with you on your kind of evolution into using Databricks. What's the lens that we'll be looking at Databricks with today?
Absolutely. So, when we were talking about this, one thing that I see a lot of is like, really good information, lots of tutorials on like, oh, you've already set up Databricks. It's already there. You've already gotten the connection. Now let's build it. And then based on questions I've seen from, that Slack channel, from clients, from people at SQL Saturdays when I'll occasionally present at those, it's like, well, cool. How do I start? What even is it? Like, is this something useful? And so general lens for all of this is so that ideally a Power BI developer or admin can go and talk to the people you work with who administer and run Databricks and give them the information to help you. So you don't both have to poke around, look at some blogs. And I'm not going to go into every last nuance of that, but there'll be a bunch of links as well. But the real idea is like help you as someone who's working with Power BI, which was me 5 years ago, doing a ton of stuff in Power BI. How do you start with Databricks to use it? It's very powerful. It's very capable in different ways. But although it's a Azure PaaS, platform as a service, which makes it a heck of a lot simpler than IaaS, infrastructure as a service, but this still isn't simple. There's still plenty of stuff to do, especially if you want to run it efficiently. So that's the main goal. And then as well, a few things any Databricks people watching should learn a little bit more about Power BI.
Okay, so it's going to provide, I think, a lot of context for people in Power BI who are curious what Databricks is, and even for people who are like proficient in Databricks, it will help them understand the bridge back to integrations and, as you said, practical applications with Power BI and Fabric.
Yep. I'm not going to go too much on how to do ETL, how to do batch, what's the Delta Live table versus Hive Metastore. Like I'll touch on them to a little bit, but those are all Databricks concepts that as a Power BI user, if they exist, awesome, but they're probably not relevant where you're just trying to get connection. Like I just want to load data to my star schema. I don't really care how reliable and fast the ETL is that loaded the data. I mean, I care. I make that happen all the time, but trying to focus on the people who are coming in at it from not knowing all that stuff.
Excellent. With that, if you're ready, I can flip over to the deck and we can get started.
Yep, absolutely.
Perfect. Let's do that. Here we are.
All right. So yeah, no fancy spyware for this one. But main idea here, practical Databricks for Power BI. So already talked a little bit about me, just a few other things on the background. I'm a group manager for data engineering, doing solution architecture, work helping run large projects, building data platforms for different companies, help out with SQL Saturdays in Minnesota. I don't travel for them as much as I'd like. I try to help in that area as well. I've really run the gamut in industries that I've helped out with, whether that's Power BI semantic models, Azure analysis services for large sales organizations, inventory models, financial metrics, running the gamut. And then and some of it is to how I started to shift to Databricks. There was once you get into that large scale, once you're past the many hundred millions into the billions, or starting to look and potentially get even bigger than that. The reality is at that point, Fabric's changed this a bit, but at that point, I wasn't going to use Power Query for my billion row table. That's not going to work. You can import it, but we needed to transform and shape the data. And because, was working so frequently, so often with these large Power BI models that needed, you know, not inconsequential levels of data engineering, making the star schemas, doing incremental loads. I started to
Hmm.
grow. What was that?
No, sorry, I was just agreeing, not
Okay.
nodding in
Oh,
agreement.
all right. Sounds good. Um, had to learn way more on, first the SQL backend, used Synapse, the first wave. I think it was whatever not PDW. I never connected to a parallel data warehouse, which was like the on-prem installation of earlier software that for what eventually was the Synapse dedicated pool. But the first Azure go around, I'm forgetting the name of it offhand. And then, using also other things, Teradata as a backend, other things, and just had to get more work and explain how to build those large star schemas, how to build those slowly changing dimensions. So naturally just did more and more data warehousing as well in service of those semantic models, whether that was focusing on SQL Server analysis services, multidimensional or tabular. So that was the evolution. And then once Databricks came along, I remember when I was interviewing for Avanade, it had been announced, in 2017 for Azure Databricks, was looking at it and was like, well, it seems cool. Like I know running Spark is good and I need it for some big data workloads, but why does it help me? Why can't I just run my Spark workloads on my own? I'll explain why that matters shortly, but rapidly realized it. And one of the nice things with Azure Databricks and Databricks generally as well is that it serves many different audiences. And so people can come at it and get the same benefits from whether they're coming from a code heavy Python, Scala, or R background, and some restrictions on the R side, or a SQL background, and abstracts it so you don't need to know every last nuance of some of the extremely nuanced and complicated things when it comes to running a Spark cluster in the cloud, if you're just doing it on your own. Um, Separately, was awarded a Fast Track Recognized Solution Architect Award for Power BI in 2022 and 2023.
Nice.
I bel Yeah, thank you. I hope, actually, I don't believe, I hope there'll be something like that for Fabric. Not sure, but I think the program seems to have ended, which fair enough. And then I was also got a Databricks Champion Award. So that's somewhat similar to that. There's a panel interview by Databricks solution architects. You have to have gone and done work in different Databricks things and give back to the community there as well. So, try to help out, teach, show things as where I can. All right.
And the one downside that because the fast track solution architect is a great label to get, but unfortunately you have to be at a reasonably large, medium to large size company to get one of those. And I know a few
Correct.
MVPs over the years have had one of those. Like, if we have all the skills to be one, but we're like independent, is there any way to get that? So I know Microsoft's at least thought about that, but it is one thing I've advocated for as well, just because I'm not my company's not big enough to actually get the certification, because it's like a company level credential rather than a person credential.
Right, right. Yeah, it's been interesting seeing as they shifted away from I think it was the silver and gold competencies into
Oh yeah, yeah.
I think I don't, and I'm not sure exactly what the level is, but yeah, it's something where it doesn't seem that even no matter how qualified someone is, at the small independent consultancies, some of these the thresholds are not feasible, unfortunately, because there's
Hmm.
plenty of great people out there who I'm sure would qualify, but are not in a large org.
Exactly.
Oh, all right. So talk a little bit about Databricks, talk about why and how this relates to back to Power BI. So Databricks founded in 2013, and there are reams and reams of far better material in the background here, trying to do the 30,000 foot, probably even 50,000 foot overview here and not doing all the things they've done justice. But founded in 2013 by the founders of Apache Spark and the creators of Apache Spark and the folks who released Delta Lake. That initially was focusing a lot on machine learning and data engineering in the cloud. So Apache Spark, I mentioned this a little bit before. first there was Hadoop. There were actually other things before then, but we'll start with Hadoop. Big data, quote unquote, back when that was the fad. What is it? Well, originally started with the Yahoos, the Googles, I think it was actually Yahoo, the huge companies that were producing unbelievable amounts of web logs, not blogs,
Yeah.
web logs. And they were writing to disk, and they were like, "This is all great, but we don't have anything." This was like the late 2000s, some point in that time frame. I forget exactly when Hadoop was coming up. And so this was also based off of some of the map reduce concepts, where you take a whole bunch of really cheap computers, as opposed to your traditional database machines that are pretty high test, pretty specialized. How can we get a lot of cheap computers go and analyze all this data? That's where Hadoop came from. So separating out all the JSONs, the TSVs, the what have yous, and then giving similar instructions to a whole bunch of cheap machines, aggregating them up, and then sending a result back. Worked, it helped. It was slow, and it was a ton of work. You needed a bunch of data centers. This is where like the Clouderas made this a bit simpler of the world. But it was also all disk-based. It wasn't much in memory. It was not very fast. It was very scalable. It was very, very scalable. But also, the reality is, back to what are we dealing with Power BI? Most organizations don't have petabytes of log data. A few organizations have actual petabytes of data. Most don't. Most have maybe a few terabytes. So it was wildly overkill for most organizations. And if you tried to run it, the overhead of getting those started up, extremely high. You needed a bunch of people who maybe even knew how to do like Linux kernel programming. Heaven forbid. I don't. I never will ever learn that. I'll stay happily in my data side. But thanks to everyone who does. So then Apache Spark came along, taking a lot of those ideas of the mapping and reducing the relatively cheap hardware. This was all still on-prem initially. The cloud was starting, though, just well on its way. And taking and doing in-memory things. So as we go back to Power BI, Vertipack, all that other good business, in-memory is good. In-memory is faster than on disk. So this was in-memory Hadoop. Way more involved in that behind the scenes, of course. I'm not going to do any of these complete justice. But that was much faster. And to date, Spark and Spark-derived things won the big data wars in terms of the technology running it. There's a lot of stuff coming out these days. There's DuckDB, other sorts of tools. There's plenty of other proprietary systems that are not taking a Spark approach, which is very parallel, and that works for smaller data sets. But Spark absolutely shines when we're talking about tens to hundreds of terabytes or bigger. It's not always the best option, just to be completely fair. If you're talking about below a few terabytes, the demo I'll show later, I only have like a few gigs because I didn't want to wait and run all of these things and configure it all. But I will also say Spark and Databricks on that same subject, are they the absolute best thing if you're talking about an organization that has like, oh, we've got 130,000 rows and that's all of our sales orders? You don't need Spark. You don't. You could technically run it in Excel, but you shouldn't. You toss it in any database and against 130,000 rows, and you can do practically anything. So I would just like to call that
I
out.
get that even sometimes with people in direct query from a Power BI scenario. Is they're doing direct query against a database. Like, what do you got? Oh, we have like a 2.5 million rows. Like Power BI can't handle like no. It's just it's a drop in a pond. You're fine. Like just throw that into an import model. Like, and you will save yourself every headache that you have right now with your data.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like these are great tools for large scenarios, but just don't use them just for the sake of using them. It'll be a good one to see there. So
This might have been off of something you mentioned, but somebody in the chat did have a question on what is the quote the Spark approach.
Sure. So the Spark approach it's really the map reduce approach, meaning if I've got tens of thousands of pretty large files or hundreds of thousands of pretty large files, how do I send those out? So how do I, it's, we had MPP, massively parallel processing systems for databases. Um, Hadoop and Spark take a somewhat high level, conceptually similar approach of split out those files, send them to a whole bunch of different computers and drives, process them there, aggregate at the end. But the Spark approach there is, take that, put them in the, you know, and then this will come later, and I'll show this in a second in some of the diagrams. Take those, put them in memory on the different computers, run your analysis in parallel, pull it together. The challenge, and where Spark and any other MPP, any other parallel system don't always work, is if your data is small and it fits on one machine, partitioning, separating it out, doing things in parallel is not free. It takes time. It takes code, for one, and it takes time. You have to send the data out, aggregate it back, send it back, aggregate it effectively, because that aggregation is one of the hard parts. And so when your data is small enough to not need parallelism, don't use parallelism. It'll save you a ton of time. But if your data is big enough, it helps, because if you try to put, 100 terabytes of JSON files onto one machine, it could eventually finish, but you're going to be waiting a long time, or tens of terabytes. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. With parallelism, it reminds me of the phrase, like, you spend so much time trying to figure out if you could, you didn't ask yourself if you should.
It's very well phrased, right? Yeah. And the other part of it too is, one thing we see with this is, it doesn't have to be, oh, I've got a bunch of small tables and only one huge table. If you have that one huge table, like, what does huge mean? Many terabytes, high 100 millions into the billions of rows, probably worthwhile. Probably. You can do it on a high test traditional database, if you know what you're doing, absolutely. But once you get to that scale, like the Databricks or Spark, other Spark offerings, there's other things like HD Insight. I always forget what AWS's version is. ECR, something like that. They work. You could do them. That's where it becomes like, yeah, makes sense. All right. So Databricks started in the cloud, started in AWS, as most things do when you're talking about Silicon Valley startups. Azure Databricks was announced in 2017, and this was a managed Spark solution. At first, they did a few other things, but the initial, okay, why is this cool, is if you want to run and stand up a bunch of Spark, I've got to learn Kubernetes, I've got to do clustering, I have to spin up and tear down dozens of VMs, manage the networking on-prem. Doable. Again, it's doable. The skills are out there, but pretty annoying, and not the skill set that data people have traditionally. I certainly don't know the Kubernetes side of it, although I've had to learn more of the networking side. But it was just complicated and a high barrier to entry. And then as well, you're running these Spark jobs. This is very bursty, typically. Spark jobs, meaning I'm going to take some Python code or some other code and then go through those thousands of files, get a result, write it somewhere, called a Spark job. It worked. You got to provision a lot of compute, get it on-prem. Cloud scenarios make perfect sense. Perfect sense, where you rent the VMs, you put in a little configuration to say put them in this network, and then let them all talk to each other. And then Databricks made that even easier, where they'll spin them up, get rid of them. You only pay for the time the VMs are running, and DBUs, Databricks units, for the time that their software's running on them, basically. This is really good. They've grown a lot. They started off like with a bigger ML focus than data engineering, but that was back in like the 2013 days. There's already a strong data engineering suite by 2017. Growing, they'd recently released, I think it was some point mid to late last year, what they call the data intelligence platform, which is an overall architecture, something also called a lakehouse architecture. We'll get to that in a moment. And then this whole time, Power BI was able to connect. Now, that's improved a lot as well. There's native connectors for Databricks and Azure Databricks. It's confusing. I'll tell you which one to use.
Good.
And then depending on the scenario, it's the only source where I don't if someone is like, I really want to use direct query, it's the only source that I am like, I don't have any fundamental technical concerns. I might ask if it's a vanity project. I'll always ask that anytime I hear about someone wanting to use direct query, but it's really quite fast. And it's the only direct query source that, in my opinion, I would ever recommend to a client. Unless,
Okay, interesting.
except
Well, technically, we do have, when we do composite models, that is a direct query connection to the data set. So that's the only thing, and I hate the fact that they call it that, because that's actually performant and fast. Every other direct query is like run away from it, like a yeah. So, but yes,
and it's
few and far in between should you ever use that connection type.
Yeah, I would say that's on the idea of without a DBA monitoring every query.
Yeah.
So if you get a DBA or some equivalent skill set, someone who's really good at performance tuning, you can make direct query fast on most other sources.
Truth.
Do you have a DBA on hand who's with a performance tuning DBA where making the Power BI reports fast is her or his primary goal? It happens. So you can get direct query can be fast in those cases, but it's not easy. So,
Agreed.
awesome. All right. So what are a few questions that I've heard? Where is my data? Is it secure? Do I need licenses? I'll go through these as we go on. Where is your data? We're talking Azure Databricks, Azure Data Lake Storage. That's where you're putting it. You're putting in Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 with the hierarchical namespace turned on. Are you as a Power BI doing this yourself? Probably not. This is how the Databricks environment would have been set up. If we're talking about Databricks and AWS, that's in S3. If we're talking about Databricks and GCP, I always forget the name of their storage solution, but it's there. These are blob object storage, just a whole bunch of files, ultimately, lots and lots of SSDs and hard drives that are sitting in a cloud data center. That's where it is. Is it secure? Now, that's always going to be a question of the whole shared privacy model between the cloud providers, you, and the PaaS offering. In short, basically yes, unless you do something really strange. It's always possible with these things, if and the ways to turn it off. Like you can allow and you can configure insecure things. By default, it's not. The cloud security, cloud data storage is set up to be secure. So you can log in, you can put in all sorts of, and this is where I know much more on the Azure side, but there's similar things for AWS and Google, and I think those are the only two Databricks has. It's set up so that they're behind private networking. You need to SSO or authorize yourself in. You have to get access, encrypted on disks. You can bring in customer managed keys if you want. If you don't trust Azure's own encryption layers. So is your data secure? Ultimately, this is going to depend on your organization's definition of secure, but in general, yes. So unless you do something really silly, like you could, and if the business case allows it, you could make data publicly available. You absolutely could if that is not sensitive. Is that still so? Those are the first two things. Do you need licenses for Databricks? Now you need a Power BI Pro license or a Power BI Premium per user license or something on Fabric for using PowerBI.com. Do I need licenses? Where do I get them? You don't need a personal license to use Databricks. Databricks gets paid, and Azure and all the other cloud providers for Databricks scenarios, by how much compute you're using. Anyone can query it, assuming they're authorized. We'll talk about how you get authorized. You don't need any special Databricks license to use it, to connect to it as someone querying it. Who sets it up? Who makes it? You're probably not going to do this on your own. Azure Databricks, well, it certainly is simpler than the pure I want to run Spark clusters on my own side. It's still Azure and PaaS, and you have to set it up in a few different ways. So typically, this might be an IT team or a particularly skilled organization or department who'd be setting it up. But then there's different things to set up where the Power BI users may have to say, do I need to learn Python? Initially there was, you always, until we had warehouses, you had to learn some amount of coding language to do basic things in here. So do you need to learn Python to query your data? You don't have to. It's an option. You may find that it's effective for orchestration, for ETL, if you're writing applications querying Databricks. And absolutely should you learn Python if you're doing data engineering, doing big writes in Databricks? Yeah, you should learn Python. But if I, as a Power BI person, just want to come in, query it, SQL. Or Power Query. You don't even have to write SQL. Should I use clusters? Should I use warehouses? What are them? First, what the heck is that? A cluster, that's that Spark cluster. It's a whole bunch of VMs, virtual machines, with Databricks runtime, which is Spark compute, Spark code, Spark libraries, and then the Databricks, logic on top of that. Phenomenal for ETL workloads, for streaming workloads in a few cases. Very scalable, really, really good at large writes, good at batch style reads, batch, not bash. And what do I mean by that? If you need to do and read, several terabytes or hundreds of gigabytes to put it somewhere, probably use a cluster, something where parallelism makes sense. But they're not really set up to be interactive. Some of the first initial connections and things that were supported for Power BI to connect Databricks, you had to use a cluster. It's not a good experience. You couldn't do direct query against it at all, and it was things were running as a job. That's where you had to learn Python to an extent. It worked. It's still technically an option. But instead, that we have warehouses, which is the more SQL first, more behaves like a traditional, for lack of a better term, database. You write some SQL, largely you can ignore all the stuff behind the scenes that makes it not strictly a database in a relational database sense. So should you, as a Power BI user, developer, admin, use a cluster or warehouse? Use a warehouse. Don't use a cluster. ETL, data engineering, ML, using clusters, occasionally using warehouses. How do you get access to Databricks? Lots of different options here. I'll touch on them a bit. In short, it's a lot simpler if your organization has set up something called Unity Catalog for Databricks, and SCIM, which is a long acronym. Basically, it takes your Entra ID, Azure ID for everyone who hasn't been paying attention to their Microsoft's various name changes, and that puts you as a user into the Databricks account. Meaning I can go and SSO in. So if I log in with my password, or if I'm doing things the right way and using something like MFA, there's multi-factor authentication, Databricks recognizes it, understands it, be on your merry way. And then it's a heck of a lot.
Just on licensing about this and access for Databricks. So if an org already has access to Fabric, would additional licenses be needed for any of the people accessing the data in Databricks?
So for Databricks, no. So if you want to connect Fabric and Databricks, I don't touch on that too much. But do you need additional Fabric licenses to connect to Databricks? My understanding is no. I'd be very surprised if that ever changed. It's another source. It's another data source from a Fabric perspective. There were a few things that were shown at the Fabric conference, talking about basically a Databricks shortcut into Fabric. I don't know that many details on exactly how that will play, but that is, as was shown at the Fabric conference, something that's coming to make Unity Catalog and Fabric work quite well and nearly seamlessly together. What I hope it means is you get sort of an auto shortcut, as it were. So if you have your tables in Databricks, that they'll be, my words, auto shortcutted to Fabric. I'm sure Microsoft will come up with a much flashier term. So if you have Fabric, you don't need nice extra licenses for Databricks. However, I was
just going to say, just similar to Fabric, it's a compute cost. So like your cost will go up not in licenses, but it'll go up in compute. Like with the more you access anything in a database, like that's serverless or that does the clustering, you'll just end up paying more for the additional access. But otherwise, then I'm assuming there's probably going to be some type of a service account or other thing that's going to connect to and do the extraction for the majority of the data pulls that are coming out of it. Databricks.
Yep, exactly. Exactly. And so it certainly takes some compute depending on what you do. From a Fabric side, it might take some of your CUs. But also, just one thing I've seen some orgs talk about is like, hey, I want to save my CUs for other stuff. And I think that Databricks might be more cost effective. I don't know if that's true. It's certainly not true in every scenario under the sun, but some orgs I've talked to have looked at it that way. They've already got a very mature, very capable Databricks-based way to do ETL. Databricks is much more code-friendly and developer-first. Fabric is not. It's much more, not. It's much more like power user focused, in my opinion. There's things in there spanning it. We just saw earlier this week more stuff on CI/CD and more ways to do programmatic operations in Fabric, but they're coming out new. Databricks is very mature and very capable in that large scale data workload for ETL and ML. So it works well there. So you may see, hey, I want to leverage all that. Excellent. Made a big investment in Databricks, and it is great for those things. Use it. No reason not to.
Perfect.
Do you need a gateway? Maybe. As with all things with gateways, back when I briefly did a little independent Power BI consulting, and I'm sure you get this as like, gateways are scary. It's like, I don't know how your VMs are set up. I don't know your networking. But do you need a gateway? Possibly. We'll talk about that in the diagrams. So what does that mean? Are your Databricks workspaces, servers, warehouses, can you hit them from the internet so that Power BI can connect to it? Or do you need a on-premise data gateway, which can be in the cloud? Thanks, name is great. Although maybe they rebranded it to Enterprise Data Gateway now. You might. We'll talk a little bit on how you can know and how to set it up. It is pretty straightforward to set it up. Azure Databricks is a first-class citizen within Azure and Power BI, so as these things go, it's straightforward, but anything with gateways, as soon as you're touching, I've got to go and install some software in a VM and open up IP ranges and yada, yada, yada. It's complicated. Is it fast? Do my queries fold? It is very fast. Databricks warehouses running SQL are quite fast. Now, fast is relative. Are you going to be able to do a complex aggregation against 1 trillion rows in 5 seconds? No, but that's because you're fighting physics at that point. Nothing can do that in under 5 seconds unless if you can, tell me, I'll work for you. We'll figure that one out together. But you can do a lot of work against it, and the reality too is you're almost never with these analytical queries running things actually against 1 trillion rows. Even if there's 1 billion rows, most queries are going to be, hey, I want to see same store sales between May of this year, May of last year, up to the 17th for the West region. Those are all dimensions. They filter your fact tables down, and instead you're not actually looking at 1 billion rows or 1 trillion rows, you're looking at hundreds of thousands to millions of rows. And that's, again, that's the mapping, but mapping with something you occasionally hear called predicate pushdown. Goes in, does the queries quickly. Does it fold? Usually. As with most things in folding, there's a few weird gotchas, but by and large, your queries will fold as long as you're following the normal, quote unquote, practices around what does and doesn't fold. Don't join on a function. Don't add index columns. Don't do anything complicated. To leave that for the database in the data lakehouse. But typically things fold.
And I have a few things. I'm actually doing a video sometime soon because I've done plenty on query folding, but I have one that's going to be like 5 gotchas, which are some of those unique things where some of the automatic steps get, at least in Power Query, will break it, but if you do a slight modification to the code, it will still fix. Like the just one call out, and then we can go on, is that I actually just discovered this week. So if you do a text filter and filter to begins with for like 3 whatever letters you're wanting letters you're wanting to put into there, that breaks it. But if you create a custom column of text.start, put the same character in, and then equals whatever you're looking for, and then just filter equals true, that continues to fold. So text like begins with the function to begins with does not work, but text.start equals something where it's not searching, it's a Boolean yes or no. That will
Yeah,
same effect, but it
Mhm.
works and it folds versus the other one. And it's sometimes where you'd think like the built-in nature functions should generally be the best practice, but they're not always. I've found.
Yep, agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then each source will differ slightly in what
Yeah.
folds. So that approach
Yep.
works for a few databases or sources, and then you shift it to another, and it won't. There'll be some other weird thing that gets that begins with to work.
And I think
So,
with most of us, whenever we talk about a folding scenario, usually if we don't mention the source, we're probably referring to like Azure SQL or something similar. At
yeah.
least what I do. Like that's the majority of the things you're connecting to. But as you just said, Snowflake has different folding rules, and it really just depends on the Rosetta and her stone and what can be translated from location source A to language A to language B.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep. Exactly. As always, it depends.
exactly.
All right. So now, not going to talk about this. I just wanted to show something about like, here's all the Databricks stuff. There's a lot to this ecosystem, and this is why I'm focusing on just Power BI data warehousing. Um, and then we'll touch a little bit on Unity Catalog. So link below, this is from Microsoft and Azure, just one of their general architectures of the overall ecosystem. Because if folks are wondering like, oh, can Databricks be my data warehouse or replace it? Probably, usually. Just like it to touch too on there's a lot of other things out there, a lot of other information on Databricks, tons of stuff in Azure, at Azure Databricks. So then I'm going to show the simpler version, and then we will hop into the demo.
Perfect.
All right. So high level architecture. So we have Azure. Awesome. Cloud service. At this point, going to not talk any at all about the Databricks and the other clouds because I don't know the exact nuances as well there, although they follow a similar pattern. We have something called the Databricks account. This is for every Databricks workspace in your organization. They all roll up to a single Databricks account. Because Databricks, you get it through Azure Databricks, you get it through the Azure Marketplace, and then set it up. There's one there. Then you have multiple workspaces, and if you're using Unity Catalog, in the interest of time, I'm only going to talk about that approach, but there's other things called the Hive Metastore or others that are more difficult to manage at scale, but are things that came around from the Hadoop ecosystem. They're still around, but we'll talk about something called the Unity Catalog from here. You have workspaces. What the heck is a workspace? Basically, from a Power BI user perspective, it's your server. It's a server string that you put when you connect to Databricks. It's a lot more. It's a wrapper. It's a place to have your different clusters, your warehouses, your code and directories and workspace logic. Place for people to connect to. Place for people to train machine learning models. They have been adding a few things. Getting the name offhand, a few more reporting capabilities inside Databricks that are nice for where you are targeting other data engineers, I think, which definitely they need the help. Not always, Power BI is also not always the best solution.
Agreed.
And so like, if you're just trying to do something for other data engineers, it's not really meant for that analytics end user. It's more, maybe an analytics thing, but it's really just here's how Databricks is running, or I need to have something. I think it's called a Lakeview something or other. They love their water analogies, which being in Minnesota, I'm always just like, when they announced Lake House as the name, I was like, well, a few of my uncles have lake houses. Does that make me a lake house expert? Time will tell. But you have your workspaces, which have your compute. These boxes, hopefully maybe a little clear. We have the Databricks account, which has your catalogs and your workspaces. Then we have the actual warehouses and clusters. These are a little different because these are virtual machines that are in your organization's Azure subscription. You can see them, you can interact with them, although not a lot because Databricks locks them down, creates them, deletes them. It loads the image on them, loading things in. You're never really logging into a VM. These are all Linux VMs as well, by the way. They're in your Azure subscription running. But again, Power BI is going to connect to a workspace, effectively server URL, and then connect to a warehouse ID. They're not the friendliest looking things. It's just a big string of numbers, but you connect there. Once you connect to that warehouse, that's your compute, abstracted away term of computers, because there can be many of them. It'll connect to your catalog. What is this? Basically, it makes your data lake look like a traditional quote unquote database. It's where we have catalogs, schemas, and tables. Tables are using Delta, Delta format, Parquet, some people say. I was very glad, by the way, and thank you for having Bowden on a few weeks back, because there was a bunch of stuff I was like, how am I going to make good slides to talk about some of this background? So
Oh, nice.
once you had him on, like, so many things he was talking about, all this stuff with Delta, and also, like, I've just been curious, like, had the occasional chat with him in odd places. Wonderful guy. Thank you for getting that interview out there. But so much of what he was saying around like how Delta works applies here. Delta and Parquet, you're storing the data here. So save me from having to put together a lot more technical slides, because everything about how Parquet works, how run length encoding works, applies here. That's what Delta is. It's why Microsoft chose it to use that with Fabric. It's great. There's other competitors there, but not sort of competitors, other offerings apart from Delta, but not going to get into those. So your catalog will connect to your storage account through something called a private endpoint. This is where, as a Power BI person, you almost certainly don't know how to set this up, if you even know what it is. Essentially, private networking, cloud networking, so that your catalog can go and connect to your storage accounts that are in Azure without being accessible to the public internet, and all through encrypted traffic. Then it gets finally back to your storage account. All of this, and then the query gets sent, the data gets put into the memory of your warehouses, gets sent back, and then processed and sent to Power BI. That's a lot of dots. Doesn't that seem like it might be slow? Fortunately, it's not. So there's a lot of moving parts there, or it might seem that way. But any questions on this picture? Trying to just, lots of nuance not getting into, because it's not super relevant for a Power BI user.
Not on this specifically, but there was a question that I gave my opinion on, is what percentage of people do you think are using large data? And by large data, those are in the trillions. I gave my estimate on like companies that actually have trillions of rows, like in a single table somewhere in their database, is like 1 to 3%. Billions is probably 5 to 10, and then millions is pretty much the rest of the companies at this point. There's a few that only use 100,000, but that's kind of the scale that at least of the companies that I've worked with in terms of counts of companies worldwide.
Sure. Good question, because it's all relative. I will say every time I've gone to an organization, the data that I'm working with is the largest data that that person has worked with, almost always, by the time I get there. The percentages I'm aware of and from who I directly work with, are a little bit higher, but the split is still there. Like, most organizations do not actually have, in a single fact or a single sort of thing, whether that's logs, trillions, most don't. It's in that low. There's a few more that have billions. But yeah, I will say this is more true at large enterprises or other large organizations that just have a lot of data inherently. Some organizations have a ton of revenue and very little data. Other organizations have moderate amounts of revenue, huge volumes of data.
It really depends on what you're doing. The companies that use devices, so gas, oil and gas, any like energy, anything that does, basically date like second or millisecond transactional recordings of something, those are the ones that I see there. And you could have a tiny little company with 30 employees that's dealing with billions and trillions of rows of data, and you could have, if you just said, a $50 billion company that their largest table is maybe 30, 40 million rows or something like that. Just because they just don't deal with data that much. They're customer facing or something else.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the way I'll refer to it is like, what's the value per row or revenue per row? It's not a great metric, but it's sort of like,
Yeah,
just because the company's huge doesn't mean they have big data, quote unquote. Um,
true.
so yeah, no, good question. Um, all right, so that's the high level. So now I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm just going to show Databricks quickly here, and then show Power BI. Well, first, let me show. Just trying to make sure I got everything. Yeah. So I'm here in Databricks. Ta-da. Logged in. Let me briefly show the Azure view of this. So if you're in Azure, you're in the Azure portal, spun up a workspace for this demo. You go and provision a workspace, get this set up. There's a few things around the networking that happen here. We've got like private endpoints, you've got different subnets, all sorts of complicated stuff there. These are the things there's a few links there and plenty on the Azure docs about this. Have this set up and working. Once you're in the workspace, you never need to see this page again. Most Power BI folks never will. But from the Databricks, people working in Databricks directly, setting it up, they'll probably be pretty familiar with this. Now that we're in Databricks, okay, where do I start? So I'm logged in a workspace in central US. I can go and I have different queries, different repos, different places to store my code. Haven't set up any repos here because didn't want to get an ADO set up just for this or GitHub. I'm logged in as a Databricks admin. Most regular users will see a different setup. I've got a whole bunch of test accounts to make this work. Then I've got catalogs. So what are the catalogs? Made a medallion architecture, bronze, silver, gold. Loaded some data in from a variety. There's something called PPCH. It's essentially a way to benchmark databases. There's data available in the samples data from Databricks, that they host, and then there's many other places. You can get TPCH data, good for running quick demos. Loaded that in, have a table here, and now we'll start to talk about actually looking at it. So then within Databricks, we have something called a Pro warehouse. This is where the VMs, and we'll start this here. Didn't set that one up on my own self. The joys. I've got another account that can do that. So then I've got different compute. So I have clusters, and then I have some SQL warehouses. Let me start those. So then this Pro warehouse, this is running the SQL, running that. Challenge of these is that it is spinning up virtual machines from within Azure. This takes 3 to 5 minutes. Then it's on, then it's running. They're quite cost effective once they're running, but it takes a little while, a little bit annoying. Other thing came out a few years ago and has gone, I believe it went GA in the last 6 to 9 months, or something they call a serverless warehouse. This is a little different. This is where Databricks is hosting the VMs. They're running and they give them to you. There's all sorts of other things to do. So they're connecting securely and data isn't leaving that I've set up here. But from the Power BI perspective, they work. They're way quicker. This one's still starting. This one will start up in a few minutes. Go and fix that access thing. Another page here. Any questions while I deal with my own foibles around data access?
Just a comment that this looks a bit more complicated than Fabric. And one of my advantages is just like, and if you watch the video that I did with Bogdan, is a lot of this is Fabric is an evolution of a lot of Microsoft projects that came together from like 4, 5, 6 different teams. So much of what was Databricks with the compute costs and all this other stuff was inherited into and evolved into the Fabric platform for sure.
Yep, absolutely, because they definitely were keeping an eye on what was easy, what was hard with Databricks, and we're paying attention there. And yeah, this is much more much more developer focused is the reality. I give this to
Truth.
so a business analyst who's pretty good at Excel and can write some SQL. Um, this is not that. You need to have a little bit higher tech knowledge to do that effectively. You don't need to have the highest by any stretch. And then there's ways, and from the Power BI side, it's not, you don't need that. We'll show that in a moment here. But yeah, once you get to this point, it's simpler from here. But yeah, all that networking stuff, it's complicated. It's, and plenty of people know how to do it, but yeah, still tricky. One thing to call out here with the SQL warehouse. So again, like I started this pro warehouse spinning up the VMs, still started. That serverless warehouse, it was already up. That took like 10, 15 seconds. So generally, if you have the option, so you're going to find as a Power BI user, serverless warehouses are way simpler, quicker for you to use. So pop into, is there anything else from this side? No. The only other thing I'll touch on is the access and how you get into these things. So there's something called SCIM. I'll have a link to that in some stuff I send out. I think I'll host it on like my Sessionize page, and then we can link to that. We'll figure that out after. But then I have different access to things. So there's, if I look at a specific catalog here, they have owners and groups, and then there's permissions, and I have different groups that are coming in and giving, the permission to select, the permission to use a schema, giving this to different groups. So if you're using SCIM, if you're using things like that, these groups will come in, you define them in Azure, set up who you are, who is a catalog reader. They can select anything from the catalog, send them over, it works. Or other people who can administrate it. You can also set this up. It doesn't have to be on the catalog level. Set this up so I'm here in a schema for silver samples. I'm not reserves. Might be logged in here. Different groups have permissions there, and I can get more fine-grained than that. Once I'm at a table, can go in and see what's in the table. So I have select privileges against the whole thing in a different account that I have in a different screen here. But I can see various details. Again, it's Delta tables, a whole bunch of nuances here. Don't really matter too much to most Power BI folks. One neat thing, and I'll switch over to the account that has all this now. Looking at line item, looking at some sample data, I've turned that serverless warehouse on and query it. See top 100, top 1,000. Then looking at some of the details and the history. One neat thing, I don't know if it came up too much in the presentation Bowden did, but this is something inherent to Delta as a format, and most other of the Iceberg or Hoodies of something like this, called time travel, where you can see the history of the table.
Yes.
So if someone screws up, or not even screws up, if someone just really needs to see what did the table look like on May 12th, you can do it. It's there. Now it's out there forever. This is stored. You don't want to keep these around for years and years and years. You can keep the history of them. So if I look at, what was the table that I did a lot on? So there was this other table, orders, where it had different levels of history, did a few different things, burned the midnight oil on the 14th after some other fun stuff at work there. But I can see the history of it. So two things this gives me. And again, this is visible and it's there in Fabric, but I don't know if it's as clean and easy to see, honestly. I haven't looked in a while. On that side of it is one, who did what and what wrote the data. This, when we're adding data incrementally, if we're doing change data capture, data is coming in every 15 minutes, once a day. You can see when it happened. Quite handy. It's just right here. The other thing is, if I need to see the data, the one case where this happens a lot is more in ML or data science. Like they're training against a certain data. They don't want to introduce any variability into it. They picked, hey, we're running against May 12th. I only want to run my ML model, bake my analyses off of the data as it was on May 12th. History, time travel, you can select from table as of this timestamp. Very handy for that. Any other questions?
Yeah, the exposure in Fabric is there, but it's not quite as exposed yet. And it's certainly not integrated in things like Power BI and stuff today, where you can do a quick time travel and kind of backtrack through time through the Parquet files. But
Mhm.
it from both platforms, it's a very nice feature to be able to, essentially have that built-in integration of current and previous version with all that stuff.
Yeah, yeah, it's very handy. Very, and it's straightforward if something bad happens to roll something back.
Hmm.
Very handy to have once you need it. Um, let me see here. Last thing, and then I'll switch to Power BI, and then quick time check. Um, how I know these don't have to end right at the hour, but
Yep.
how are we doing
Yeah, you're
there?
you're good. I'd say, we probably have let's say max of about another 15, just to not run on too long, but otherwise like plenty of buffer if you want to talk about a few of the things and wrap up. And then there are a couple of questions that when you're at a good stop, or there is a question at a good stopping point that I'll bring up as well.
Okay, cool. All right. So SQL warehouses. The last thing, and then I'll finally look at Power BI. Now I don't have the rights here, so I'll have to go to a different user. You'll run into a theme of that. Everything can be controlled, and didn't do you get everything perfect for that. So that other pro warehouse finally turned on. I have this serverless warehouse. I can have monitoring. How many queries ran? So these were me as we turned it on. It being the warehouse, I can see these. These are the Power BI user may not have the permission to see this. But the other neat thing here is this history. Who logged in? Who did what? Whether this is for auditing or if it's say back to the question of did it fold? Here's where you look. So this is what Power BI did, all of it. So we look at this SQL warehouse. We just one of these that where you have the relevant permissions. Different people can manage or can use. So you get relatively high permissions there, but you need them. So I come in here. Then the first thing I need, and this was accessible if you just have the ability to use it, I get this server host name. That's this. This is that the workspace is from a Power BI perspective, it's your server, the connection string. That's it. Do you need the port and the protocol for Power BI? No. If you're doing more custom stuff or different applications, you might need this. And then the last thing you need is this HTTP path. This is how you tell Power BI, use this warehouse, this specific warehouse. If you have the permission to get here to look at it, you can turn it on. You're able to turn the warehouse on. You don't need to go and submit a ticket to turn this on. I start a query. The serverless warehouse is off. I go to Power BI and I start my query. This will turn on in a matter of seconds, maybe low double digit seconds, but usually faster than that. And then
Mm.
up and running for you. Also, other people can use these. These are not for individuals. These are meant to be shared. Now, I made an extra small one because I'm running this in a subscription I own. So it was a fun exercise in keeping costs down. They're not terribly expensive, but I also didn't want to go and be wasteful with it either. So running this as an extra small, they're still very powerful. Last thing here, and then, hey, did my query fold? There's this monitoring tab. You can see it's running. There's one cluster underneath it, one VM, basically. I can see the history, look at all of this, see when I was doing and building some of the stuff in Power BI here. There's that history. You want to know who accessed what. It's all here from that security, that auditing perspective, but more from a Power BI side. You can see how well did my queries run. I did a select star from line item. You can see here's the query that it ran. This was what Power BI wrote. Not what Power BI wrote, but what Databricks wrote. They're more involved from coming from Power BI. Who ran it? And then a few things on the performance tuning side. Now this, nerd out all about performance tuning. If you ever need to put someone to sleep and they don't mind listening to my voice, I'll just let me start talking about performance tuning, whether it's Vertipack or Databricks or anything, and I'll talk about it for hours. But the key things to note here, that scheduling time and then that running time. I'll zoom in a little bit here just because this one gets pretty small. So you get wall clock duration, And it's just starting. There's nothing in the cache. There's data loading into memory on the warehouses. You can see optimizing query and pruning files. So back to when I said, hey, your query is going to be for same store sales May to May for the West region. Typically that leads to pruning. So instead of, these are all files, .parquet, .snappy, or .snappy, .parquet files. One of the biggest ways to do, one of the biggest, really the only good way to run data quickly in the cloud is don't read any more data than you have to. Databricks has a ton of stuff here. Now they've released a lot of that into the Delta protocol. So other people contribute to the Delta protocol, but they're the main contributor. To do that, to say, oh, I know this Parquet file because Delta has metadata and Parquet has some metadata. Like my range for May and West does not exist in this file. I don't need to look at it. Skip it. Fastest way to do anything is to not do it at all and do as little as possible. That's the optimizing and pruning. Executing is actually running, aggregating, like I said. So this optimizing, query, and pruning, back to that whole Spark approach, similar concept, but done in a way that's much meant for more interactive of, first, what files do I need? This was not something Hadoop really did at all, although things came later on it that lets you do it, but at this point, just use Spark. Prune the files, and then only run your aggregations against files that we care about, and then aggregate them up back together. Rest of this, not super relevant. I will say this bytes read some cache. This was slower because wasn't in the warehouse yet. We pruned away 4 files. This is not, and then this is how you can get to the faster direct query side. There's a few things you might have to change, but you certainly don't need a full-time DBA focusing on this. There's the few things you can tweak are much, much quicker and simpler to do. Other nice thing, and I'll show one for this in a moment, is this query profile. Again, that would be more nerding out on tuning. These get far more complicated if you're doing a bunch of joins. And then with that, I will finally turn into Power BI Desktop. All right, so I made, as we can all see, an amazing visual that clearly captures the insights and actions you need to take about your order amounts from 1993 to 1997. I kid. Clearly, this is was not focusing here too much, unfortunately, on making the nicest dashboard. But once data is loaded into Power BI, anything you can do with an import model, you can do here. So let's say I want to connect. So I'm going to go pop into transform data, pop into queries. Some of these I put into DQ, some of them I put into the direct query DQ. Others I didn't. Let's say I want to connect. I'll start just how someone would start Databricks. So we have Azure Databricks, and then we have Databricks. What's the big difference? Azure Databricks, this is where you get a lot more tight integration. There are some ways to get SSO with the other flavor of Databricks, but this is Azure Databricks. If you're using AWS hosted Databricks, GCP hosted Databricks, barring something I missed in the docs, you're using this other connector. But assuming you're in a Power BI shop, your data is in Azure Databricks, use Azure Databricks. So let's connect. Standard, put in your host name, HTTP path. We have that from here. Connection details, the server host name, and the HTTP path. Now you have options to plug in a native query if you want. If you happen to know the SQL you want to write, you can absolutely plug this in. You have to specify the catalog you want to connect to as well. I'm going to start this one as direct query because I've ran into all sorts of fun stuff around changing tables into direct query after. But I'll start it with direct query so you can see that. You can also change this to import. Hit OK. Now coming through, so I'd already logged in there. I'd already logged in this. It's using unrecognized, hey, Alex.demos at Barbeau Data Labs is already logged in. Just reuse it. Just again, like anything else, any other Power BI connection. I can see my catalogs. Then I can see these folder looking things here. These are your schemas. look at silver samples, and I can see my tables. The other thing that would have happened if my serverless warehouse wasn't on yet, or if the pro warehouse wasn't turned on yet, it would have taken a little bit more time to get to this point. Then I made another catalog just to show there can be many catalogs. I put a date table in there because we can load data from multiple catalogs, whether that's import mode or direct query. I will say, unlike direct query in other cases, the data between the catalogs, and didn't grant myself access to that one, so I won't show that here. Direct query between multiple catalogs, totally fine. If we were to say, oh, I want a direct query between 2 Azure SQL databases, even if you made that one Azure SQL database fast, it'd be extremely difficult to do direct query between the two. Not so much a concern here, because it's all just abstracted away. The warehouse, it's the same. It's one warehouse pointing to many data from many catalogs based on what you have access to. So I'm going to load in line item. This is only about 30 or 60 million rows, so everything against this will be fast. Again, not trying to show what's the fastest thing we can do here.
Yeah.
But you can go way bigger. So line item direct query. One thing to note here too, got a whole bunch of columns, did the typing, Power Query did its thing of figuring out what to write, did this whole esoteric M. Although this side of it, I happen to know how to write. One thing to note for those who love to parameterize your connections, as everyone should, unfortunately, this GUI for the source doesn't directly let you pass in a parameter, but you can. So, I put in, a warehouse. This is just a general best practice for anything with Power BI. You're connecting to servers, warehouses, databases, whatever, put them in a parameter so that when they change, you don't have to rewrite all your queries. Back to this line item DQ. It's going to hit load here. This is not going to look pretty, but I want to show, because it's just pure, very lightly cleaned up line item data direct query. I go and look at it. Direct query, well, it's not imported, so there's nothing here.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say I want to look at I'm only going to write very little DAX on the fly here. Coming in, looking at ship mode, that was direct query. Again, not that much data, and we're not going to do too much on the performance analyzer, but direct query in ship mode, let's say, and we're going to define a new measure of the sum of extended price. Line item DQ, extended price. Now, annoyingly, it goes into whatever table you have selected over there. We can load that in, and ta-da! How meaningful is this? This particular one, not that fast, or not that meaningful. But, I'll go in and change the home table to line item DQ. Can write many more complex things, and there is one thing I noticed there. Probably in the interest of time, not going to show the tabular editor way to change import tables to direct query. But can load this through, direct query comes through, and then publish this up to powerbi.com. So I'll show that one here quickly and then call the demo good. Actually, first, since I'm already here, we'll go back to this warehouse view, and then you can see some of the queries. They just came through here. So you can see the queries I was submitting now in that below half a second range. One of these was a little bit more. You can see, hey, my select ship mode, sum ups extended price, group by ship mode comes in right here. So again, this is not a very complex query by any stretch. You can do much more. But if you want to see, hey, this is what Power BI did, literally. If it's slow, you can look at this, start to figure out what do you need to change, whether that's it didn't fold. You would see like the last step if you were doing import mode. Or you can see if you need to do some of the options Databricks has for tuning. But it's all there in the warehouse logs.
Excellent. And I think the the performance certainly and the integrations directly into Power BI, and as you mentioned, even with just direct query, it works quite well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's still things when you're talking about, and there's former colleague Kyle Hale, who now works for Databricks. That's one of the things I've linked in the last little bit is, has a good trillion row demo on Databricks. Using aggregations, using drill through tables so that when you're looking at that trillion row table, you're doing something that can actually be completed. Definitely something to take a look at for what's available there. And that was in 2022. That was the demo was 2 years ago. Things have only gotten better since then.
Exactly.
All right.
Really,
So
I mean, end of the day, it boils down to the ability for, well, one, how many rows or cells values are being handed out in the query itself, but then like how quickly can the system actually process the data? Because one of I would say it's not the pipe that's actually usually the biggest limiter that I've found with direct query stuff, because the pipe's pretty big to transfer the data across. It's the core system. How quickly can it process data? Like SQL is not designed for on-the-fly aggregations, super slow against something like that. But Databricks, and it's both in the way it's stored and its its compute and clusters and all that, is designed to do really quick computing. So therefore, even with direct query, it still performs well. Just like with the new Lakehouse mode or direct lake mode in Fabric, is because the system and the way that the data is stored is designed to compute very, very fast for calculations directly against it, rather than having to do an extra transformation layer of a model or anything else.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. It's quite powerful. It's great working with it compared to other tools I've worked with. Very fun to work with. The very last thing I think I said I'd promised I'd get to was showing the do you need a gateway or not? So here in PowerBI.com, I haven't set up a gateway. I'll tell you a little bit about that part. I've got the different models put into this. You look at settings. Do I need a gateway? So this workspace, that has open networking. Your org may not have open networking on your Databricks workspaces. May have something called private endpoints or front-end security. If you do, you'll need a gateway. You can use on-prem gateway or a VNet gateway. If you use an on-premise data gateway, please don't actually put this in your data center. That should be a VM in the Azure region that Databricks is hosted in. I know it says on-premise, not really. It doesn't have to be. Or VNet gateway if you're on the flavors of Fabric or Premium that support it. And then after that, basically it. You set up the connection you want to go through, data source credentials. If you're using direct query, you probably want to check this box so that any row level security or table access is set aside and it gets enforced. But after that, you can largely ignore the fact that it's Databricks. It just works very well.
There.
All right, and that is the demo.
Perfect. And let me flip back over to this screen, and then I have a couple questions. Oh, this one, and a few questions that I will queue up now. So, from earlier, Matthias had one on if he does need to interrupt the service for not being billed at any point, who in the org can, or maybe better said, should be doing that?
Good question. I didn't touch on that too much. So the way that Databricks, all the compute, all the clusters, the warehouses, unless you specifically tell it otherwise, will turn your compute off after a set amount of inactivity. So is it just going to keep on running? This is a pay per use, but it's spinning up VMs. It's not going to get rid of them immediately because then you got to load data in memory again, and that's slow and inefficient. They'll keep them running. Most of the defaults, depending on the system, are either 15 minutes if you're using clusters or warehouses, or 60 minutes for clusters. If you don't use them, they just turn off. You're not billed. You're still billed for storage, but once the compute's off, you're not charged for it. So that, which I think is getting at the bigger question and the bigger worry there. Like if you leave it alone for a weekend, are you going to see this huge bill? Unless you specifically set up the cluster to never turn off, no. Now, who can do it? Workspace admins. Anyone.
Sure. Okay.
Or people given that right to that one cluster or warehouse.
And one other one that I had from Donald. Pop this up. If you have used Databricks for years with ADF for orchestration, managed tables in ADLS, and Synapse serverless as the front end, would it make sense to move to the Unity catalog instead of Fabric?
Very good question, and one of the tougher ones. Mostly on the, would it make sense to move to Unity catalog? Yes, 100%. Barring a lot of code that runs and won't work in Unity catalog, I would say any organization using Databricks should use Unity catalog, barring really weird circumstances. So now, if by the front end, if the front end means use Fabric warehouse again instead of Synapse serverless, also yes. I will say in some projects I'm working on, we have a very similar structure. Although I'm not 100% sure on the managed tables, but that might be just the Databricks terminology there. We're replacing Synapse serverless with Databricks serverless warehouses. And then we're looking at adding Fabric in as well for last mile or more departmental use cases where those teams may not have the Databricks skills or that level. But Fabric, as we saw again back in the Fabric conference, they're going to be releasing some integrations. I don't know the details between Fabric and Unity Catalog that'll let you take your Unity Catalog tables, look at them in Fabric, and that can be a completely workable front end instead of the serverless warehouses in Databricks.
Nice, excellent. Thanks for the detailed answer on that one. And I have a follow-up one on myself from me to you on, given everything that we've had here, what would a couple of takeaways be of some learning resources or places to get started for either people who are maybe wanting to explore Databricks at all, or also for the person already using it, maybe a couple things to read to upgrade themselves a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of docs from the Power BI side on how to connect Power BI to Databricks, how to model for it. Should you use a star schema? If you're doing import mode, absolutely. If you're doing direct query, you might find that a one big table approach works in some cases, but not really only one huge table. But if you're using direct query against Databricks, it does better in that scenario, but it's still not. The dimensional stuff still works better. Chris Webb and Benny Lee had a presentations a few months back on, Databricks and Power BI that I'd reference and say is well worth watching. They're both experts in what they do. Definitely one that I would suggest. Other places to get started, there's some good Azure training resources out there for I think the DP900 talks about it a little bit. It talks about Synapse too, and you don't need to worry about that. Traditional Synapse analytics, not the thing called Synapse and Fabric. That'd be a good place to start. And yeah, I've got a few links that I'll put in the Sessionize place where I put this deck as well later.
Excellent. Yeah, that'd be great. And getting a link to that, I'll throw that into the YouTube description on my blog to link people back to your Sessionize or wherever else you want to direct them to.
Sure.
Greg just finally popped on. He was apparently refactoring a gnarly model with a friend.
As he does.
Said different model, or same day, different model. Yeah. But this has been very informative for me. I really appreciate the information that, especially, I think you started from both the questions and what would the questions be that people would want to ask about Databricks before getting into the demo, which I think gave a lot of good context initially.
Yeah, much appreciated. Yeah, I look forward to going back when I have something else to share. But
absolutely, yeah.
Thanks as always for hosting these.
Oh yeah, 100%. And whenever you have a new idea, feel free to reach out and let me know. I'll happily have you back on. And a lot of thanks from people in the chat. Donald says thank you for the information. You learned a lot as well.
Happy to help. Yeah, no, it's great to share some of these things I've learned, and I appreciate everyone who tuned in. Thanks again, Reed.
Exactly. And with that, I'll wish you a good rest of your Friday. Have a great weekend, and yeah, I'll hopefully get you back on sometime soon.
For sure. Looking forward to it.
All right.
Bye.
Take care. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. And if you want to help support this channel, take a look at our channel memberships or our merchandise store for cool swag. And last but not least, please consider sharing this video on your social media platform of choice to help our channel grow. So, until next time.